The November air hit me like a wall the moment I walked out of Guelph Courthouse. My daughter was already waiting by the truck, her breath making small clouds in the cold. She was 16, and trying very hard to look like none of this was affecting her. I could tell it was. I unlocked the doors and we both climbed in. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The parking lot looked exactly like any other parking lot on any other Tuesday afternoon. Gray pavement, bare maples, a Tim Hortons cup rolling slowly in the wind along the curb. Nothing about it looked like the place where 21 years of marriage had just ended. My daughter broke the silence first. "So what happens now?" she asked. I stared at the ignition key. "We figure it out," I said. That wasn't much of an answer, but it was the most honest one I had. I pulled onto Stone Road and headed north. The radio came on automatically. Some country station my daughter tolerated without complaint. The heater rattled. My right hip ached the way it always did in cold weather, an old injury from years of lifting commercial equipment that I'd never properly dealt with. At 63, you stop expecting certain things to improve. My phone buzzed on the console. A message from my son. He was 19, in his first year at the University of Waterloo, an hour and a half away. He'd driven down for the hearing that morning and headed straight back to campus afterward. He hadn't said much. Neither had I. The message was a screenshot. I glanced at it at a red light on Woolwich Street. My stomach dropped. It was a photo from a restaurant, a place I recognized near downtown Guelph. My wife, her sister, her brother-in-law, her parents, and the man she'd told everyone was just a colleague. Champagne glasses raised, wide smiles. Someone had written a caption underneath. "Fresh start. So grateful." One of my daughter's cousins had accidentally shared it in the wrong group chat. Nobody had meant for us to see it. My daughter was looking out the passenger window. I set the phone face down on the console. 40 minutes out of the courthouse. 40 minutes. She eventually asked what the message was. I told her it was from her brother. She nodded and went back to watching the passing fields. She's sharper than she lets on. She probably already knew. We stopped at a gas station just outside the city. I told her to grab whatever she wanted from inside. I needed a coffee and 2 minutes alone. Standing by the truck in the cold, I called my lawyer. She answered on the second ring. Her voice was measured the way it always was. "How are you holding up?" "I've been better," I said. "What's going on?" There was a brief pause. Something came through about an hour ago. From the trustee. I leaned against the hood. "Already?" He'd been waiting for the decree to be finalized. The moment it was, he moved. I closed my eyes. 8 months. I had waited 8 months for this moment. 8 months of sitting across from mediators and lawyers and financial evaluators. 8 months of keeping my mouth shut while people around me assumed they already knew how everything would end. 8 months of watching my wife build a version of events that made her the reasonable one, and me the man who'd spent 2 decades prioritizing work over family. There was some truth in that. I'll admit it. I'd spent a long time believing that keeping the business running was the same as being present. It wasn't. "How did they take it?" I asked. My lawyer paused again. Her counsel stepped away from the table. Apparently it took a while before he came back. The gas station sign hummed above me. A pickup truck pulled in beside me, radio playing too loud. I watched a man pump gas and scroll through his phone like it was any ordinary afternoon. "Okay," I said quietly. "Are you okay?" I laughed a little, the first time all day. "I'll let you know." My daughter came back out carrying 2 hot chocolates and a bag of chips. She handed me one of the cups without being asked. 16 years old and already more emotionally generous than most adults I knew. We drove the rest of the way home mostly in silence. It was about 8 months earlier when this whole thing started. Not at a courthouse, not in a lawyer's office, but at my kitchen table on a Wednesday morning in March. I'd come home early from a job site. My back had seized up on me, nothing serious, just enough to make me useless on a ladder. My wife was out. Some meeting or errand, I didn't think to ask. I made tea, sat down and started sorting through the mail that had piled up over the week. Most of it was the usual: hydro bill, property tax reminder, flyers for the grocery store, and then an envelope near the bottom of the stack, addressed to my wife, return address from a financial services firm in Mississauga. We'd never dealt with anyone in Mississauga. I set it aside. Then I picked it up again. I stared at it for a long moment, feeling vaguely uneasy without knowing exactly why. We had our own financial planner, a woman we'd both worked with for years whose office was in Cambridge. I knew every account we had together. Or at least, I thought I did. I shouldn't have opened it. I know that. But I did. Inside was a quarterly statement, a TFSA I had never seen before. The balance was just over $41,000. The account had been opened 14 months earlier. The contributions had come in steadily, several $100s at a time, regular enough to look deliberate, small enough not to draw attention. I read it twice. Then I put it back in the envelope. That evening, after dinner, I asked about it. I kept my tone light. Her head came up fast. What statement? From a firm in Mississauga, arrived today. Something moved across her face, just for a moment. Then it was gone. It's just an old account. I forgot about it. Nobody forgets about $41,000. I didn't push further that night, but I didn't sleep well either. Over the following weeks, I found 2 more accounts, both unfamiliar, both in her name only. The money wasn't vanishing. It was accumulating, slowly and carefully, like someone building a cushion they didn't want noticed. I called a forensic accountant a friend had used years ago during a partnership dispute. Retired CRA, Canada Revenue Agency, 22 years of following financial paper trails. Dry, methodical, not much for small talk. We met at a diner off Highway 6. He ordered black coffee and listened without interrupting while I laid out everything I'd found. When I finished, he looked at me across the table. You want the short version or the longer one? Start with the short one, I said. Money is being moved, carefully, over time. That's not an accident. I felt something cold settle in my chest. Not anger, not yet. Something closer to grief. Over the next several weeks, he dug deeper. What he found wasn't a simple hidden account. It was a pattern, transfers connected to a name that kept appearing. A man my wife had introduced as a colleague the previous year. She'd mentioned him in passing a few times, described him as someone involved in real estate and private investment. Seemed successful, seemed confident. I'll call him what everyone called him, Preston. The accountant called me one afternoon while I was supervising a refrigeration install at a grocery store in Cambridge. I stepped outside into the parking lot. You need to see something in person, he said. The next morning, he spread several documents across his desk. The picture they painted wasn't what I'd expected. Preston wasn't wealthy. The image, the tailored jackets, the investment talk, the dinners at good restaurants, was borrowed. Several private lending agreements were overdue. He owed money to at least 4 individuals I could identify from the paperwork, and almost certainly more. He had a way of presenting opportunity convincingly, then quietly deferring when things didn't come together, and then finding the next person who believed in him. My wife had been one of those people. What made it worse, what complicated my anger considerably, was that she hadn't been directing the scheme. She'd been funding it, believing in it. Sending money she thought was going into a private real estate venture, something she'd been told would set her up for retirement. He wasn't stealing from her exactly. He was borrowing from her indefinitely, with no intention of stopping as long as she kept believing. I drove home that afternoon and sat on the back deck for an hour. The yard was quiet. The neighbor's dog barked at something across the fence and then stopped. I thought about the woman I'd married, the person I'd built a life beside for 21 years, and felt something I hadn't expected: pity. Not for myself, for her. It would have been easier if she'd been calculating. Life is messier than that. A few weeks after that, my son came home for the weekend from Waterloo. I found him in the garage, fiddling with the old lawnmower we'd been meaning to fix since August. You know she's going to leave, right? He said. Not looking up. I didn't answer immediately. I don't know what's going to happen, I said. That was true. He set down the wrench. Whatever she decides, don't disappear on us. I looked away before he could see my face. He was 19, and somehow he'd found the one thing I needed to hear more than anything else that year. The divorce proceedings started 6 weeks later. My wife had already made her decision before she said it out loud. The conversation happened at the kitchen table. The same table where we'd helped our daughter with her grade 9 science projects. The same table where we'd had Christmas dinner with both families for a decade. She said she thought it was time. I asked if there was someone else. She didn't answer right away. She didn't need to. The months that followed were full of lawyers and financial disclosures and mediation sessions in beige offices. My wife wanted the house, a substantial share of our savings. Her legal team was thorough. Mine was careful. What nobody in that process knew, not her lawyers, not the mediator, not most people close to me, was what I'd learned several months earlier from a trustee connected to my former business partner. My partner and I had built the company together over 20 years. When he died from a sudden illness 4 years ago, I thought most of our arrangements had ended with him. Apparently not. He had been quietly thorough in ways I hadn't fully understood at the time. An estate trustee had been waiting, legally required to wait. As it turned out, until certain conditions were met, the finalization of my divorce was one of them. The timing of that phone call was not accidental. My old partner had planned it carefully, even from the end. That was exactly the kind of man he was. I carried that knowledge through every mediation session, through every moment when someone across the table assumed I was losing, through every well-meaning neighbor who offered slightly too much sympathy, the kind that lands more like pity than support. My daughter found me on the back deck one evening, about 2 weeks before the final hearing. She sat down beside me without saying anything. For a while, we just watched the yard go dark. Then she said, "You seem different lately. Not bad different, just different." I thought about explaining everything. Instead, I said, trying to figure out what comes next. She pulled her knees up to her chest. "You always tell me that hard things don't mean wrong things." That stayed with me. The final hearing came on that gray Tuesday in November. My wife appeared confident. The settlement reflected what she'd pushed for. The house, a significant share of our savings, a monthly arrangement. My lawyer thought we should have fought harder on certain points. I agreed with her on some of them. But I had chosen patience over aggression, 8 months of it, and it had started to pay off in ways that weren't yet visible to anyone else. That same evening, as I drove my daughter home from the courthouse, the trustee made his call to my wife's legal counsel. Legally permitted the moment the divorce was finalized. Nothing improper, nothing rushed. Just a conversation that opened a series of questions nobody had thought to ask. My lawyer told me later that the mood at the restaurant changed within 20 minutes. Her counsel excused himself from the table. Came back looking different. The champagne glasses apparently stayed full for the rest of the evening without being raised again. 2 weeks later, Preston disappeared. At first, people assumed he was traveling. Then his phone went unanswered for 4 days. Then 5. His office in Burlington was locked. His assistant claimed not to know where he was. Several investors who'd trusted him were suddenly asking very direct questions through very serious lawyers. The Financial Services Regulatory Authority of Ontario had been looking into his activities for some time before any of this. We were not the only ones who'd noticed the pattern. My ex-wife called me on a Saturday afternoon. I almost let it go to voicemail. Then I remembered we had 2 children together, and I answered. "Have you heard from Preston?" she asked. "No," I said. A long pause. I thought maybe he'd. She stopped. Her voice sounded unlike anything I'd heard from her in months. Tired, uncertain, like someone who'd been holding something heavy and finally set it down. "I haven't spoken to him," I said. The call ended shortly after. I stayed at the kitchen table for a while after hanging up. I'd spent a long time imagining how I'd feel in that moment. What I felt instead was something close to sadness. 21 years is a long time to share your life with someone. Watching her come to terms with what she'd trusted and what it had cost her was not satisfying in the way I'd once thought it might be. By January, my daughter and I had settled into something resembling a routine. Wednesday dinners, Saturday morning grocery runs, Sunday afternoons watching whatever she decided she liked that week. Small things, the kind that don't announce themselves as important but turn out to be everything. One morning, she tried to teach me how to make her grandmother's biscuits from memory. We made a mess. The first batch came out flat. We made a second batch, and they came out worse. We ate them anyway and laughed about it. Real laughter, the kind I hadn't heard from her in months. That mattered more than anything else that had happened in the previous year. In February, I attended the annual Guelph Community Foundation Gala, an event I'd skipped the year before. Our company had donated refrigeration services to the hospital fundraising committee for several years running, and a board member had personally called to say it would be good to come. I almost didn't go. My daughter made me. "You've been in this house for 2 months," she said, without looking up from her homework. "Go." There is no arguing with a 16-year-old who is right. The event was held at a hall near the Hanlon. Several hundred people, local business owners, community figures, families. Midway through the evening, one of the foundation board members said something about recognizing local businesses that had given without seeking recognition. He mentioned our company, a longer mention than I expected, including a story I'd nearly forgotten. A winter 2 years ago when the hospital's cold storage system failed overnight, and my crew had driven out in -17 weather to fix it. No charge. Nobody had ever asked us to publicize it. I felt my face go warm. Several people nearby turned to look. Then I looked toward the side of the room and found my son standing there. He'd driven down from Waterloo that afternoon without telling me. He raised one hand in a half wave. Then he walked toward the stage. I had no idea what he was about to do. He spoke quietly at first, just to the board member, who handed him the microphone with a smile. The room settled. "My father," he said, "doesn't talk about the things he does." He was 19, and his voice was steady. "This past year was the hardest year our family has been through. And through all of it, he showed up. For every difficult conversation, for every drive to school, for every moment when it would have been easier to disappear." I looked at the tablecloth. He taught me a long time ago that doing the right thing doesn't always feel good. It just matters. The applause that followed lasted longer than I was comfortable with. Across the room, I saw my ex-wife. She was standing near one of the windows, holding a glass of water. She'd come alone. She was watching our son with an expression I didn't quite have words for. She was crying quietly, not dramatically. The way people cry when something true finally lands on them, and there's nowhere left to put it. For the first time since the divorce, I understood something clearly. None of this had ever really been about the money. Not the accounts, not the settlement, not the trust. The real loss had been something else entirely, and neither of us had been willing to say it plainly until now. 3 days later, there was a knock at my door. My ex-wife stood on the porch alone. No lawyer, no sister, just her in the cold, hands in her coat pockets. "Can I come in for a minute?" she asked. I stepped back. Sure. She sat at the kitchen table. I made tea for both of us. For a while, neither of us spoke. Then she said, "I owe you more than an apology, but I'll start there." I didn't answer. I wanted her to finish. "I stopped talking to you a long time before any of this started," she said. "And instead of figuring that out, I found someone who made me feel like I mattered. And I ignored everything that didn't fit the story I wanted to believe." She looked at the table. "I know what that cost. I know what it cost the kids." I sat with that for a moment. "I wasn't a good partner either," I said. She looked up, surprised. "I spent 15 years convinced that keeping the business healthy was the same as being present. It wasn't." I shrugged. "I miss things, not because I didn't care, but I miss them." She nodded slowly. We didn't say much more, but we said the things that needed saying. The conversation lasted almost 2 hours. Some of it was hard. Some of it was just quiet. By the time she left, I think we'd both let go of something we'd been carrying far too long. I stood on the porch and watched her headlights disappear down the street. Not with satisfaction, not with anger, just with a kind of stillness that had been missing for a very long time. A year later, my son finished his first year at Waterloo and came home for the summer. My daughter had her learner's permit and was convinced she was ready for the 401, which she absolutely was not. We argued about that cheerfully for 3 weeks. One evening in late June, the three of us drove out to Bellwood Lake and sat by the water until the light was almost gone. Nobody had planned it. It just happened. My son threw a rock into the lake and watched the rings spread. "You seem better," he said. I looked out at the water. The air smelled like pine and cold and everything that's good about a Canadian evening, when you stop long enough to notice it. "I think I am," I said. The revenge I'd imagined at the beginning never came, not in the way I'd pictured it. Nobody was publicly destroyed. Nobody stood in a courtroom and confessed. What happened instead was quieter and, in the end, more lasting. The truth surfaced. People faced what they'd done. And I stopped measuring my life by what someone else had taken from it. Preston faced a formal investigation through the FSRA. The consequences unfolded slowly, as they always do when the law takes its time. The image he'd spent years maintaining came apart the way false things tend to. Not in one dramatic moment, but in a slow and undeniable unraveling. My ex-wife worked hard to rebuild her relationship with our children. It wasn't quick, it wasn't easy, but it was sincere, and eventually, it took hold. The trust my old partner had arranged made for a comfortable retirement. Not extravagant, comfortable. At 63, comfortable feels like exactly enough. If I've learned anything from all of it, it's this. There are things you cannot stop from happening. Other people's choices, other people's recklessness, other people's capacity for believing what they want to believe. You cannot outrun any of that. What you can do is decide what you build after. I chose to build something quiet, something honest, something my kids could look at and not have to explain to themselves later. That turned out to be the only kind of winning that meant anything at all.